Thank you very much for two really wonderful papers. I really admired the clarity of purpose and the clarity of argument in both cases, and was very persuaded. So the question is an attempt to create some kind of dialogue between them, although obviously there are many points of contact and confluence. Hannah Arendt, I hadn't anticipated would play such an important part in discussions both yesterday and today. And it seemed to me that both of you, to some extent, were reading Arendt against the grain of her intentions, whether implicitly or explicitly, and please correct me if I'm wrong about that, but both of you did some work of abstracting elements of Arendt's thinking in the way that you made your arguments. The question I have then is, what is it about Arendt's style of thought, her ways of thinking, her ways of using concepts, that makes her an attractive site to think through your questions about democracy?
You spoke about that.
Well, I'll maybe use, a decision that I made, about the book that hopefully will be finished sooner rather than later, very soon. So I got reviews. I got wonderful reviews for the book, and one of the pressing things that a reviewer said is that I would have to address the sort of the parody, whether how Arendt was right and how she was wrong to be looking toward 18th and 19th century Western Europe to think about the United States in the 1950s, right? And it was like, how do you think about that comparison? And my initial thought is, isn't it evident? She's saying the same thing that Toure and Hamilton are saying in my head, right? The way that it's like the sort of phenomenon of racism, as I see her sort of identifying it in Origins, looks a lot like what Toure and Hamilton are trying to tell us about institutional racism, both of which get obscured, I think, by the hegemonic understanding of racism as ideology, right? That it's that at bottom it's a form of belief, and you have to reconstruct that system of belief before you can locate it as a certainty in the world, right? You can have racial inequality, they say, without having racism. And I think that that's just not true. But that is the imperative that the scholarship had set up. And in some ways, people use Arendt to establish that imperative, right? And so I find her so compelling. And I mean, the reason why I insist upon going back to her, and I think a lot of Western thinkers. So, I mean, I think one of the things that was said yesterday by Tony Bowes, and that was established by Muhammad today, was the importance of looking at other archives, right? Looking at other traditions. And I wrote in my notebook the importance of comparative traditions. And I am persuaded that that's such an eminently important part of what we are called to do today, so that we can share a world of thinking. But I also think that we have to tell better stories and have a better relation to Western thinkers, these like dead white people. And I mean, I think it's also important that Arendt is a Jewish woman, right? She's a white woman too, importantly, especially within the American context and what she's doing. And part of that is going back to look at the resources that she gives me to think as a thinking person, which then makes me her peer, which allows me to judge and evaluate and to say what I think she gets right and what I think is troubling and problematic in the sort of, thinking about the moment that I'm currently in. And I just think that she does a good job. Like, she's a good thinker. I really think that. Like, Arendt makes mistakes. She's anti-Black. She's kind of like, I think about Arendt as like the boys. It's like they're brilliant and they're annoying in some ways. It's just like, wow, you're pompous, But it's just like, if you can do all of that, you might be pompous too, right? So that's how, like, there are people that we engage. And so I think that's why. So that was very circuitous. I didn't need all that.
Yeah, I would start from there. She's simply great. You do ask. I don't know. It's quite obvious for me. But I did not engage, obviously, directly with Arendt here. I did a little work, just some work on her concepts of the public space and in the public elsewhere. But this was not my concern. I simply, for me, she is an obvious resource to think with about the political, because she starts with the many and not with the individual and not with the subject. That's the first thing. And here I just found myself, as I tried to think about what is this thing that is called democratization. I found myself identifying what I thought about as something that resembles labor. So I just use it and try to use the other two terms in order to build a more coherent picture. But it was not that I was asking this question and then went to read Arendt and see what she wrote about it or something like this.
Jacques. Thank you both. Completely lovely. I wonder if I could press a little bit on the givenness of systems of phenomenology on one side, and then similarly on what I think I heard in Adi, which was something that I think I agree with, but then I wonder how practical or possible it is, what you might call a tactical teleology for democratization, so that under certain circumstances, procedures of democratization would have to employ a telos and a form of closural concept in order to achieve certain ends, which would then, you could then retreat from through the practices or further practices of democratization once you have achieved a momentary democratization. And so I wondered whether I saw these two as parallel moments in your argument. On one side, givenness, of a kind of phenomenological givenness that I wanted you to, I'd love you to say more about. And then to Adi, if you could say more about what I was hearing there about a kind of tactical or practical teleology that might be usable in that unionization drive in the Starbucks, where you come up with a telos for the moment.
You definitely have to go first.
I think all you need is to realize that whatever campaign for voting rights or whatever, whatever is the object of a campaign achieves, this is not the end of the story. It is simply not the end, because you have no guarantee that the reform that the struggle was able to win would be implemented, that would be implemented fairly, that it would be implemented without creating further after effects that would create more inequality or something disturbing from a different angle, which is not expected. It is simply the part of the logic of action here, which is pregnant with unexpected consequences. And therefore, you should be always on the guard. And you should be always on the guard, because power, by nature, by its nature, and here I am, I cannot I cannot substitute it. I cannot substitute it for anything else, and I cannot defend it in a more sophisticated way at this moment. But power, the first thing that I think we have to understand about power, that it wants to be more of itself, and because of this, whoever has authority and is not well regulated or constrained by others, would like more of this authority, or at least that this is an expected tendency of many people who hold authority. And therefore we have all this transgression and then discretions of the system toward less democratic procedures, etc. So it's inevitable that the work will not be reached an end. And this is in the best circumstances, and we are in what seems to be much, much worse circumstances.
So the givenness of the system of phenomenology, I'm like, what are you asking?
I wrote it down.
Oh.
My impression was that you were arguing that embodiment is a given, and that with embodiment comes a phenomenological system, and that givenness of embodiment as the world of a phenomenology is something that we can deploy against racial common sense. And I was wondering about the status of the givenness there.
So my thinking is that that's the work of politics. We should understand the work of politics to protect reality, because reality is vulnerable, right? Even though the system of phenomena, or the reality, is given to us, right? So, oh boy, I'm trying to figure out how to explain this. So it's really in response to what racism does to reality, right? Like it overlays, it tries to materialize a myth, right? It materializes the thing that isn't real, or the thing that is being projected onto people, bodies, events to configure power in a certain way so that you don't have to share the world, and you can insulate yourself from the influence and impact of those that you want to excise from having any say-so or any impact on the shared world that we have together. I mean, I didn't say that quite eloquently. But it's really sort of response to the problem that race presents us with, that through the symbolism of race, we have a mythology, right? And it's a collectively, culturally made mythology, falsehood. And we behave as if it were true. But like the insight that I'm using here, or the thing that I'm really trying to grapple with here is like, you know, value reality. So I use the example. So I think about Merleau-Ponty and the way that he talks about what it looks like to engage somebody with a hallucinate, to see someone hallucinating, right? Like he talks about like a man or patient, someone who is a schizophrenic, who is looking out the window and talks about a man that he sees in the garden. There is no man in the garden. But the next day, they put a man in the garden that looks like the description that the person gave. And the hallucinator is like, that's not the man, right? You know, there's someone else, you know, there's two or something like that, right? Like, he can tell the difference between the hallucination and actuality. Like, he literally relates to the hallucination in a different way than he relates to actuality. And our job as people, and that is what racism is. It sort of fills the room, it fills our relations with mythologies, you know, misrepresentations of what actually happened, along with reality. And it is our job to call out the misrepresentations when they emerge and when they happen. I mean, so I give the example of like, and what I understand how I understand racism to operate, to work too. So it's very easy to point to Trump and say, oh, there's a racist. But part of the intervention of the book is that we don't get Trump without a political system that cedes to white power, that gives white constituents way more power, way more say-so, way back in the day, like immediately after the civil rights movement, to make way for this moment that happened right now. It is something that gets out of control, and we lose, like we get to the extreme because of all the other incremental things that we have made room for and that we have allowed in the everyday. So yeah.
I can't resist. I mean, I could, but I don't want to resist. So in your example, the hallucination example, both of them are, both the hallucinator and the medical staff are correcting each other on what they take to be the truth of the case.
No. So
No?
no.
Isn't the hallucinating person saying, no, that's not the man that I saw yesterday?
But the man that he saw yesterday is just for him. That's not reality, right? Like, so it's like the hallucination is different than the actuality of the man in the garden, because the actuality of the man in the garden is available to everybody that's looking at the man in the garden, right? Like even the person who's suffering from schizophrenia, the hallucination still remains a hallucination. And even the person who's hallucinating is relating to that hallucination differently than they relate to reality. It doesn't mean that they're not captured by the hallucination, right? That the hallucination doesn't wreak havoc on their world, that they don't need treatment, right? But there is a difference. And what I'm saying is that if we're going to be able to if we're going to be able to respond to like people who are caught by alternate facts. Actually, there was an article written, not recently, like April 2024, that said, you know, we think about misinformation as like we're thinking about it differently. The people don't relate to misinformation the same way they relate to actual facts, right? So there is a project involved. There's a knowledge project that's involved, and these people, and it's a commitment that they install to actualize a violent actuality where they don't have to share, they don't have to be accountable to others, they can use violence, and in some ways, by acting like they don't know the difference between the two, we allow them to wreak havoc and to commit violence against our lives symbolically. And that's the insight that you get from Black studies, from the I think pessimism and cynicism that's coming from Afro-pessimism in some respects. It's like, because we also participate in allowing people to get off the hook with like misrepresentations of the truth, and we see it and we let it happen. Like, and we sort of we give people a pass, and so I'm like, I need to use an example. I don't want to use an example. I'm talking too much.
Yes, we have quite a few questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'm going to start doing the bundling. So if we could have Laurie and Susan with their question.
I wanted briefly to say thank you to Adi for taking an isation word, which I typically associate with technocratic management practices, and actually seeing how it can be thought with labor. And so that'll I need to sit with more. My question is for Ainsley about, there's so much about this paper I want to talk to you about, and one of the things that strikes me about the status of the law in your argument, on the one hand, I think the idea that the law can't transform sentiment, but sentiment can transform the law. I think there are, in exactly your response to Jacques when you were talking about back in the day, and I was thinking maybe even further back in the day, like say the 17th century, the law has in fact helped to transform sentiment, but not in an emancipatory way in terms of, establishing categories of free and not free along racial lines. But I take your point about the myths of the expectation that the law is going to free, that it's tied to a kind of wish or a dream of progress. But I wonder about whether there's a different myth that is both really terrifying and also maybe has the embers of some possibility in it. And that is the attack on critical race theory. So what I find so interesting about that attack is, in the first place, it is totally hallucinatory. Nursery schools, kindergartens are not teaching critical race theory. It's not, and it has had an enormous outsized effect in exactly the kinds of ways you're describing. But at the same time, I wonder whether there's also a kind of a backhanded acknowledgement of the kind of work that some ways of doing law, of interpreting law, might in fact make a kind of fragile, limited, have a kind of impact on opinion. That's what the anti-critical race theory activists, Rufo, et cetera, are afraid of. Does that make sense?
So Ainsley, I understand also that my very citation of you, while in a certain way a compliment, is also a shutting up, because what I was talking about as hallucinatory is not the specificity that you give it. And that puts you in the impossibility of, saying, thank you, Susan, but also no. And,
Don't worry, I didn't feel that way.
okay. But and I get that. And I also want to say that thinking is universal. So, like, Arendt's good to think with. So is Hegel, actually. So there is something in thinking that is universal, but not in the content of thought. That's my point. The content of thought is always specific. I mean, Adorno says it is history. The truth is not in history, that's Hegel, but history is in the truth. So there's always specificity about the content of thought. And if that specificity is universalized and robbed of its particularity, it becomes myth. That is, for me, myth. I'm understanding you now pushing with the notion of hallucination, and also why hallucination could have also been what you went to instead of what I loved, the fact that you went to the public opinion, because I think it's really important. But there is in this idea of hallucination something harder, which is that there's a kind of getting away with things in this, and I would, okay, so what I would like, my question is, I would like to push you on articulating the two men in the garden. You know, I mean, because in Adorno, you know, single things can burn up was my example of a tree in a garden. So you can't leave out the specificity of the tree, but you're saying something else with the hallucinatory man and the other man both in the garden. And I want you to push that a little bit further, because I think that we don't quite have it yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm not saying that law isn't important. I'm not trivializing the law. What I'm trying to do is respond to the pessimism about politics that's happening in Black studies. And I'm saying that, well, if you define politics as the law, then you miss what politics can do. Your understanding of politics is too narrow. And I understand that understanding of politics to be too narrow because of the way we do politics. And so it is an invitation to broaden the way that we understand how we do politics and the possibilities of politics and what that would look like to marshal that and to bring that into actuality. So that's what I'm saying. I am not coming for the critical race theorist. I'm not saying that law is not important. Yeah. But I think that's important for me to say, right? Like, because yes, law is important. Really, I mean, I like the fact that we have certain laws and not others. And we are going to see just how important laws are as we see people tearing down the infrastructure that we have built up. So let me try to ground this. Like, part of the problematic is that it feels like the world is moving so fast around this issue of race and like how it's manifesting itself. But one of the examples that I had in mind is that, so like I tell the story about a Black pharmacist who goes to a meeting, the intern makes a mistake about like people, like he says most Black people are on Medicaid. That's not true, you know, or whatever. She brings it to the attention of her superiors, who draw her into a meeting with the intern and the superiors, right? And she says, you know, hey, you made a mistake at this presentation. And the intern starts to cry and says, I didn't mean to offend you, okay? And part of what I'm saying is that in that moment, just that sort of small interaction, the reason why the pharmacist, the Black pharmacist, is concerned about the intern's mistake is because thinking most people on Medicaid are Black has implications for how you might view patients, how you might evaluate their case, right? It's a matter of how race figures into how you see people who are on public aid and your ability as a pharmacist to do your job, impartially, and to uphold your duty as a citizen of a democracy where you're supposed to treat people equally. That's the sort of like general concern that brings it to the fore. But when the intern responds, I didn't mean to offend you, she makes it into a matter of character. and then everybody else in the room goes along with that, and then what ends up happening in this particular example is that the pharmacist, like, everybody's like, oh, after she was invited to have this public meeting with the intern about her mistake because she made it publicly at a presentation, then when the intern starts to cry, everybody systematically goes back and decides that she overstepped her bounds and that she's making too much out of it, right? It's like on the granular everyday level that these offenses are happening, and we don't understand the full significance of them. And what we do is that we'll say things like, oh, well, the intern might have been, was being made to feel ashamed. You're naming and shaming. Or, there's power differentials here, et cetera, et cetera. And it's missing, like, the power differential is there because her superiors invited her into a meeting with the intern. It wouldn't be the pharmacist's fault, to sort of have that power differential. It would be the people invited. Why did they make that decision? And how we understand power unfolding, we can't just take these prefabricated stories that we have for thinking about these things. We actually have to be present on the ground as things are happening in our midst and hold people accountable and figure out how to live together, how to relate together so that we can actualize universal principles like equality in our actual relations. And I think that there's a number of ways we can think about the scale of that. And that's kind of like how I see this point about, attending to the sort of phenomenological event as it's unhappening, attending to its actuality and the circumstances that are happening, the powers that are unfolding, and making us sort of stand up as people who are going to attest to it and respond to it on the ground in order to actualize racial equality as a living actuality. Now, given the situation we're in, it feels in some ways it's like, well, is that even a pipe dream now that we are under the kind of like assault that we are? But I still think that on some level, we're going to be in these interpersonal relations where we have to, have these struggles and fights, right? But yeah. So I'll say that. I still didn't answer the thing about the man in the
So
garden. But
we have 6 more questions. So I think we should hear them. Maybe hear in 3 first. No, we'll just hear the question. Hear them all. Okay. Okay, so Mark, Tim, and then gentleman behind Tim, Emily, Diva, and Anne. That's what I have.
Thank you. So thank you for both papers. Adi, very quickly, just a brilliant articulation of the labor of democratization in macro context, micro context, and those in between. It was just really, just opened up so many vistas for me. My question, it's not a critique of your paper. It's a worry that I have, the way someone might run with it. I found especially powerful this idea of democratize in the here and now in your own spheres of being. I mean, that's really lovely and important. Like, so what can we do here and now? Like, for example, in this room, in this university, in this city, et cetera. Here's my worry. Maybe it's about someone like myself who sometimes wants to, go to Washington and protest, sometimes wants to move to Canada and just get away from it all. My worry is being so attractive to the idea of local democratization, the idea of kind of creating these enclaves of spheres of democratization, that there's almost a temptation then to withdraw from the more macro work of the civic, challenging the nation state.
Tim.
Thank you both for their presentations. I'll notice you're culling a lot, so I'll just try to read what I wrote and do my best and keep them there. Adi, my question for you is And obviously, thanks both for the presentations. My question is, what are the differences between an opening and a mirage, I guess I'm thinking about, or like a mirage or something that appears to be an opening but may not be? Thinking about something, because if democratization, right, requires these openings, does that definition presuppose that the openings need be real? Like, do they need to be real openings, as in, this looks like an opening, I go through it, but it may be labyrinthine, or it may actually be something that I think, right, is taking me one way, but is actually returning me back. I'm thinking about Fela Kuti's, teacher no teach me no nonsense, and right, this idea of like democracy is crazy, right? That the idea that the more one is like has democracy foisted upon them, the more crazy their situation becomes. So be interested to hear about, does an opening, in as you're articulating it, require a level of like utility or change? Does the opening need to result in something happening, or is it sufficient to say that democratization has openings? Sometimes they go nowhere, sometimes they go somewhere. So like, what does an opening need to or not need to do, as you understand it? And Ainsley, my question is about, I guess, like this relation, like, can mythology be made actual, if not real? And I'm thinking about the Washington Post and Bezos' move with the op-ed section. Like, it is a fact now that the op-ed section is not an op-ed section. It is a section that is editorial with 2 directives, right? So I guess, what are we to make of, I guess, the distinction between them, and like how porous, right, is that distinction at times? How actual, I guess, is it? Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you both.
Emily?
I'll also be quick. I really appreciated both of the papers. I just sort of wanted to ask you both what you think about ghosts. Because, yeah, for Adi's paper, there's a lot for me that rhymes with Derrida's conception of justice, and in terms of the no longer and the not yet as part of the constituency of possible democratization. So yeah, I was curious what you thought about that. And then for Ainsley, yeah, I really appreciate this thing you said about a reality as a collective achievement. And I was wondering about the bounds of that collective in terms of, yeah, ancestral knowledges and creations, creativities. So yeah, thank you so much, both of you.
Diva?
Thank you so much for both papers. I had a question about world making. So I'm very, very taken with the idea of politics as world making. And I am wondering how it resonates with, Adi, your notion of, because I was sort of taking it as democratization as one of the labors of world making. And so I kind of want to hear more or push in both directions in terms of thinking about how we sort of like accomplish this labor of world making, but is there a possibility of making it stick as work? Because as a thing that's made in the world, not as a permanent thing, but as something that we can think of as a shared reality, as this kind of achievement. So it's a kind of maybe a dialogue between the work you all are doing and how it might help us understand periodic actualizations that have to be defended and then remade in different ways.
I need to think more. They should answer.
Well, I'm going to throw in my little question, which was just to ask both of the speakers to compare the notions of common sense and second nature. Second nature came up in Mark's presentation, and it was mentioned. And it's interesting that second nature is used in the sense of until it becomes second nature, right? So second nature is obviously artificial. And so I'm just interested in the way that common sense is being used as something which is also a hallucination, and second nature, a sort of utopic hallucination, and how these terms are being used in these papers. But we have a little bit of time, so why don't we? Yes, we do. Well, I mean, we don't have any time, but I said, I was told that we could go till 1:15, so we do have until then. Is that possible?
So the
So-
lunch
so
break
maybe
will
you
be an
just
hour.
Sorry?
Lunch break will be an hour.
So you will, so if you want, if either of you, would you like to address any of the things that came up for you?
So it will be hard. Briefly, very briefly, the local and the global, yes, the tension is there, and I do not want to preclude the rhizomatic networking of small groups with larger movements, and with more orchestrated politics in the usual sense. They can flow together. What I insisted on the local, because I think that in our situation we have to make sure that at least this exists. This is the kind of the minimum for maintaining the level of democracy. Our openings are a mirage. They shouldn't be. They are meant to achieve specific results. Sometimes it's illusionary to think that there is an opening here, and you fight for something and you realize that you fought for nothing. But this is not what the
you suggested that you insisted that the nature of the opening must be then indeterminate.
Yes, I mean, what would be considered an opening is dependent on the circumstances. So it's the conditions of the struggle and the conditions of the power that exist that determine where an opening can be achieved. And this is what I meant. I meant that there couldn't be any theory for this. For identifying where is an opening can be achieved. About ghosts, I'm aware of the region element here and the democracy to come, but I don't need the democracy to come. So there is a ghost. If there are many ghosts actually, and the main ghost is the frightening ghost. The condition would be worse. This is the real ghost that should occupy us, because this is what we are fighting for. It's not only to better our condition; it's to escape from the worst, and the worst exists as a ghost. I think, I think that the justice as a ghost is less crucial for my description here, from our analysis here. But maybe I'm wrong. I have to think about it more, and I don't think I can capture more than this in such a short time.
Mythology can be materialized. So I do think that, right? It can be instantiated through our relations, through our behaviors. But that doesn't make it real, right? And substantive. And I think that is an important difference. And I'm going to take the opportunity to sort of talk about the like people who are suffering from schizophrenia, who are confronted with the actuality of their hallucination. So Merleau-Ponty talks about how you'll have someone suffering from schizophrenia and say they see powder, white powder, and then you'll put white powder on the table, and they'll say, "Oh, that's not the powder I'm talking about," right? Or that, that's a different kind of powder. And the whole point is that everybody sees the powder that is there. The person hallucinating sees the hallucination, right? And actually, that's not necessarily the best, because I'm still thinking about the individual thing. Like that's why you need Fanon, because Fanon tells you how a hallucination is collectivized. And the whole point is that even like, but we're still in the situation of the sort of the schizophrenic, because just because you have culturally produced something that's an approximation of reality doesn't mean that reality itself is not there and can contest and can be made contestable. And what I'm saying is that we should understand our job as doing that. And then what does it look like to manifest a politic that does that? I think that's the central question we should be asking, and that's what we should be working toward. And that's how we should be evaluating our political practices
Great.
and what we do. So that's the guiding thing.
Great, great.
I do want to, I'm sorry. I want to say that quickly. I care about stability, of course, right? So I think we have failed that we're in a situation where democracy, exercising democracy might end, carries with it a threat of death to the precarity of life. Like we have failed. And that's another reason why I find Arendt such a useful thinker, because she's trying to think about what change looks like and keeping alive the spirit of change and alteration and responsiveness at the same time that you want to maintain stability and institutions and instantiate something that has some fortitude against assault. So I did want to say that.
Thank you, everybody.